Our reading for today comes from the first book of Maccabees, chapter 4, verses 36 to 59. Then Judas and his brothers said, "Now that our enemies have been crushed, let us go up to purify the sanctuary and rededicate it." So the whole army assembled and went up to Mount Zion. They found the sanctuary desolate, the altar desecrated, the gates burnt, weeds growing in the courts as in a thicket or on some mountain, and the priest's chambers demolished. Then they tore their garments and made great lamentation. They sprinkled their heads with ashes and prostrated themselves. And when the signal was given with trumpets, they cried out to heaven. Judas appointed men to attack those in the citadel while he purified the sanctuary. He chose blameless priests devoted to the law. These purified the sanctuary and carried away the stones of defilement to an unclean place. They deliberated what ought to be done with the altar for burnt offerings that had been desecrated. They decided it best to tear it down, lest it be a lasting shame to them that the Gentiles had defiled it. So they tore down the altar. They stored the stones in a suitable place on the Temple Mount until the coming of a prophet who could determine what best to do with them. Then they took uncut stones, according to the law, and built a new altar like the former one. They also repaired the sanctuary in the interior of the temple and consecrated the courts. They made new sacred vessels and brought the lampstand, the altar of incense, and the table to the temple. Then they burnt incense on the altar, lighted the lamps on the lampstand, and these illuminated the temple. They also put loaves on the table and hung up the curtains. Thus, they finished all the work they had undertaken. They rose early on the morning of the 25th day of the 9th month, that is, the month of Kislev, in the year 148. They offered sacrifice according to the law on the new altar for burnt offerings that they had made. On the anniversary of the day on which the Gentiles had desecrated it, on that very day it was rededicated with songs, harps, lyres, and cymbals. All the people prostrated themselves and adored and praised heaven, who had given them success. For 8 days they celebrated the dedication of the altar and joyfully offered burnt offerings and sacrifices of deliverance and praise. They ornamented the facade of the temple with gold crowns and shields. They repaired the gates and the priest's chambers and furnished them with doors. There was great joy among the people now that the disgrace brought by the Gentiles was removed. Then Judas and his brothers and the entire assembly of Israel decreed that every year for 8 days, from the 25th day of the month of Kislev, the days of dedication of the altar should be observed with joy and gladness on the anniversary.
This is not an easy time of year for many reasons. It is as if the entire culture has come together to tell us that we need to be jolly and happy all the time. On the one hand, I understand. The pandemic is hard and people have been denying themselves a lot of happiness for many months now. Christmas can be a way to buoy spirits, help people feel better. Then again, it can backfire. Telling you to be jolly all the time when clearly you aren't can be annoying at best and at worst deepen the negative feelings one associates with the holidays. For people who are raised Jewish, this can be doubly so. Assuming that everyone celebrates Christmas can overlook important cultural and religious differences. Without meaning to necessarily, those differences can be trivialized, a feeling no one enjoys. So this morning, I want to look at some of the things that make Hanukkah unique, its stories and its traditions. We won't be pretending to celebrate Hanukkah as our Jewish brothers and sisters do. I think Hanukkah is important for what it can teach us, and perhaps some spiritual nourishment we can get from our personal reflections on the 8 days that are known as the Festival of Lights. How far are you willing to go? All heroes ask this of themselves, religious or secular, fictional or real. Challenges will come our way, Sometimes they're mere inconveniences. Other times they are existential threats. At least that's how they can feel. The natural reaction to this is despair and depression. Woe is me, we say. It's a disempowering feeling. It makes us ask, what can I do? One such leader was Judas Maccabeus, which means Judas the Hammer. Now, Judas is not to be confused with Jesus's disciple who happened to have the same name. This Judas was raised in Israel under the Seleucid Empire around 160 BC. The Seleucid Empire was what we would call Hellenized Greeks. The empire left after Alexander the Great, but before the Roman Empire. And as we heard from our reading today, the local leader of the Seleucid Empire was an emperor named Antiochus Epiphanes IV, who outlawed the practice of Judaism. Now, not only did Antiochus outlaw Judaism, he added insult to injury. He went into the sacred temple in Jerusalem, the one built by Solomon, so the tradition goes, and placed within it statues of animals and of the Greek gods. This is known as the desecration in Judaism. Remember, Judaism has a very strict rule against creating graven images. The emphasis was on no other gods before me. So to take those images and erect them in the Holy of Holies was a direct slap in the face to the Jewish religion and outraged a number of people. Now, this upset people, but what are you going to do? The Seleucid Empire is big and nasty. To go up against them is to take your own life in your hands. Well, a fellow by the name of Mattathias, where we get the name Matthew, decided to start a rebellion. This really was an existential threat to the Jewish people in his mind. Jews could not be who they were if they could not worship the God of their tradition according to their laws. So Mattathias was so good at resisting these actions, he wound up getting himself killed. However, his son, Judas the Hammer, or Judas Maccabeus, took up the mantle. Judas Maccabeus led what has come to be known as the Maccabean Revolt. It was a guerrilla-style warfare that was ultimately successful in forcing the withdrawal of the Seleucids from Israel. Now, the crazy thing about Hanukah is that it really is two stories that get smushed together into the same holiday, even though they don't have a whole lot in common. The story of the lamps with oil comes from the Talmud, the Jewish commentary on the Bible. After all those statues had been removed, the story goes, the Jewish people had a rededication ritual for the temple after it had been desecrated. Or at least they were about to. They were working on it. Rather than have an image of God, they decided to have an eternal flame lit that was about to run out of oil. And then, as you may be familiar, this eternal flame was able to go 8 days on 1 day's worth of oil. That's the miracle we most often remember about Hanukkah. It's why we fry things in oil, like potatoes to make latkes, one of the foods associated with it. Children play games like spinning the dreidel and winning coins. Now, many scholars believe that one thing that both Christmas and Hanukkah share is that they both are appropriations of the original Festival of Lights, the Roman holiday of Saturnalia. The Christians associated Saturnalian customs with the birth of Jesus. This is where Christians get things like Yule logs and mistletoe, a plant like the evergreen tree that stays green all year long. Pagans use this as a metaphor for the ultimate return of the daylight on the darkest night of the year. The Jews associated with Saturnalia celebrations of lighting candles in the home with the rededication of the temple following the victory of Judas Maccabeus. Indeed, the association of the two holidays, Saturnalia with Hanukkah, is made clear in the Babylonian Talmud itself. Now, astute listeners to this story of Judas Maccabeus will hear some rather disturbing things. First of all, to kind of paraphrase the Beatles a bit, if you say you want a revolution, what you're really talking about is war. Make no mistake about that. Hammer was an earned nickname. There is violence in this story. Judas Maccabeus killed people in order to achieve his goal. It's a truism that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. The difference is mostly who's writing the history books after the fact. Fortunately, there's Unfortunately, there's more than a little triumphalism in the Maccabean story. God is on the side of the victors. Judas is the winner, so that makes him right. Napoleon famously once quipped that God is on the side of the most artillery. Violence isn't always the best answer. Judas Maccabeus has inspired more than one violent fundamentalist. Every tradition has them. Now, while I may differ on the conclusion, one has to admire Judas Maccabeus' dilemma. Do we just sit here and take this while they put statues in our temple? What are we going to do about it? Now, that last question doesn't necessarily have to have a violent answer. However, it is an invitation to a vision for an alternate world. How could the world be different? What can we do together to make that world come about? In both Judaism and Christianity, the answer to that question became what we would call messianism. That is to wait for a person to come along to lead us to a new land. It's a longing for a great man or woman to act like Moses did and lead us to that promised land. Such a Messiah was often believed to be a political revolutionary or a political leader, again, much like Moses was. Christianity and Second Temple Judaism added a more kind of metaphysical dimension to all this, but at the end of the day, they were still waiting for the return of the Messiah or the Christ. Christ is the Greek word for anointed one, a reference to how David was made king. The Messiah, when they eventually do come, is believed to be a direct descendant of King David, which is why Matthew opens his gospel with Jesus's genealogy to demonstrate he was descended from King David and therefore a candidate to be the Messiah. So one answer is to wait around, see if a Messiah springs up in your lifetime. Many people have done so. Judas Maccabeus and his friends were through being patient. The Maccabees said, "We're the ones we've been waiting for." That message and that vision gave them hope. From a certain point of view, Judas's story is one of the earliest stories of hope and liberation. He could wait around and hope for a miracle, that one day is where the oil will last 8. Good luck with that. Or he and his friends could fight to overthrow their oppressors and gain their religious freedom. From that point of view, we might put Judas Maccabeus in the same category as our own George Washington. Hope, you see, is what motivates action. Not always violence, but at least some action. All of us have our struggles. Despair is a common temptation, especially this time of year, especially with everything happening in our country, our state, even our environment. Sometimes it feels to me that despair may be the only logical response. But despair is the absence of hope, and hope is what keeps us pushing forward. To give in to despair is to cease the struggle altogether. Hope is what gives meaning to our actions. We hear that very clearly in the song heard from Holly Near on being willing and open to change. Near is a folk singer who's no stranger to social activism. You may be more familiar with one of her other songs, which actually appears in our hymnal as number 170, "We Are a Gentle, Angry People." She wrote that song following the death of Harvey Milk. Music, you see, moves our emotions and gives us hope when we're mired in despair. That's really the message of "I Am Willing," which has gained a lot of popularity amongst UUs, particularly in these Trump years. It inspires us to not give up hope. Let anger and frustration motivate you to action. Transmute those feelings into love and compassion. We have the capability within us to articulate a vision for a better world, and even better, we have the ability to make that better world a reality. So hope is not merely the wish for a better future. Hope has pragmatic effects in the present. It keeps us motivated in the pursuit of justice here and now. The trick is to keep fighting, which is not to say we need to resort to violence, but other forms of conflict are sometimes needed. One positive example of Judas Maccabeus is that he stands up for what he believes in, what is important to him and to his community. Besides, in a democratic society like ours, sometimes wearing a pink hat can be more effective than wielding a hammer. UU ethicist and theologian Sharon Welch notes that many of the important issues of our time are not ones that can be easily accomplished. Systemic racism and patriarchy aren't fixed simply by who gets elected in one cycle. We're talking generations of struggle here. Even if you're up against an empire, the struggle for justice is worth it because it educates the next generation. Our children learn from watching what is important to us and how we strive to make things different. In her book, A Feminist Ethic of Risk, Welch argues that the world of social change is bigger than we are. It takes more than one generation to chip away at those monumental struggles against racism and sexism and any of the systemic oppressions that concern us and ruin our world. As a result, she urges us to act at two levels. At one level, we should do all we can to work towards justice in our lifetimes, to get in there and turn out the vote, to raise money, to clothe and feed the poor, to urge our politicians to do the right thing and show courage in the face of opposition. These are the fundamental elements to the struggle for justice. But there's another level we have to operate at as well. We have to expose our children to this work, explain to them why we do what we do and why it is important to us. Show them not only what we do, but how we do it. Share not just our wisdom, but our passion. Share with them what gives us hope so that it will give them hope throughout their lives. Because if the struggle for justice ends with us, it will end unfinished. Education by example, mentoring, and most of all, patience are required to ensure that the work goes on beyond our finite span of life. Of course, the irony is that Hanukkah is a holiday that has been celebrated for generations. It went far beyond Judas Maccabeus, his followers, and their offspring. It's a worldwide remembrance of justice, struggle, and liberation. Hardly anyone remembers the Seleucid Empire or Antiochus Epiphanes IV. Oppressors and dictators are not what history values. We value the people who give us hope, who had the courage in the darkest days to light a candle that sparked a flame in the hearts and minds of those around them, that sparks our hearts and minds today, down through the ages. So too, should we not abandon our ideals just because things get hard? Just because one person we cared about doesn't get elected doesn't mean all is lost, nor is the world made automatically perfect just because one person does get elected. All is lost when we lose the passion that made us care about them in the first place. Hope is for the long haul. It is for generations. May we give our children the gift of hope this holiday season so that they may give it to their children and for generations to come. May we be open and willing to light a candle of change when the world becomes dark and scary. I love you. Go in peace. Happy Hanukkah. Amen. I invite you now to